We're going to talk about the basics of drawing today, and it's a big subject, and it's a difficult subject, and it's a frustrating subject. So let's get to it. Of all the things to draw, the human figure is the most difficult, and of all the skills to be one as an artist, I think drawing is the most difficult. So we have our work cut out for us for sure, but I'm going to give you a few strategies that have worked beautifully for me, and I hope they'll work for you. So let's get to it. First off, I'm going to define art, just to make things simple. I'm going to keep it a simple definition, and I'm going to say art is an idea. Now, every time I define anything in art, in my pursuit of better craftsmanship, I'm going to define them as simply and as functionally as possible. I want definitions that speak to the truth of it, but simplify the truth and give me an into getting control of that truth. And so we're going to define art as an idea, just that simple. Art is an idea, and therefore an artist is someone who has an idea about the world. If you like to paint pretty pictures like I do, then the idea will be an aesthetic idea, but it doesn't even have to be that. So art is an idea. An artist is someone who has an idea about the world. That's simple. So that begs the question then, what's our idea or ideas today? And we're going to have two ideas, and they're probably not going to be surprising, but we're going to define them in I think probably surprising ways, and we're going to refine them in ways I don't think you'll have seen before, and that's going to be our way of getting control of our craft, I think, is the way we define them and then the dogged determination to stick with them. The two ideas, let me give you those first. It's gesture and drawing, and again, you've probably heard those terms before. I'm going to define them for you in a few minutes. But let's just stick with those two ideas for a second, those two terms, gesture and structure, gesture and structure. The problem we have usually in our how-to courses, in the books we get, whatever lecture series we look at, people we talk to, gesture especially is like chasing smoke. And what will happen if your teacher or the author of the book is going to talk about it at all, they'll talk about it for the first 2 or 3 minutes of the process, and then it will mysteriously evaporate and fade away, and you'll never hear the term again. So once you're into those toned renderings, rendering away, there's no room for gesture anymore, and oftentimes there's not even room for true structure. They're just talking about, well, this plane is in light and this plane is in shadow, but that's not enough to get control of and to understand true structure. So the way I'm going to define gesture and structure is going to be, as I said, a little different and much more in depth. And what we want to do, if these two ideas are good ideas, they should carry us through the whole process. They should get us for the first few marks in that 30-second, 2-minute gesture drawing. They should get us that highlight on the nose for that final rendering in that beautiful portrait commission, or in the moldy figured mural commission that we did for the local library. The gesture and structure, if they're good ideas, if they're functional ideas, and if they're true ideas to life and to our artwork, then they've got to be there throughout. They've got to be workhorses that carry us through the process. And that's where the ball gets dropped, I think, is the beginning process of most systems will speak to these things on some level. They might use different terms. They might just not be using terms at all and just show and tell. But they're there on some level. But very quickly they fade away once the rendering starts. And so what we're going to need to find out is how to make gesture and structure not only work and be functional for us in the very beginning, and that's what we're going to start with today, but when we get into rendering in tone with light and shadow, when we get into painting in color with warm and cool and rich and gray, it's still got to be there. And even when we get into the 3 dimensions of sculpture, it's got to be there for sure. And so let's get started. We had two ideas. We said art is an idea, and artist is someone who has an idea about the world. We today, and for now, are going to have two ideas about the world. Those ideas will be gesture and structure. Gesture we're going to define as the connection between the parts, and structure we're going to define as those parts. Now, if it's a very simple form, it could have one part. We're dealing with a very complicated form. The human body, it's going to have multiple parts. And with the human body, we're going to define the parts simply from joint to joint. and simply because that's convenient. Our definitions are always convenience-based. We're not worried about art theory, we're worried about functionality. So if we define the back of the hand from knuckles to wrist, the forearm from wrist to elbow, the upper arm from elbow to shoulder, all the way through the jointed body, those are our parts. Sometimes we can take a part that's small and simple and add it together with several other parts to make a simpler, greater whole at our convenience. But our definition still stands, the jointed parts. Gesture is the connection between the parts. Structure are the parts themselves. What could be simpler? A lot of things could be simpler. It's going to give us trouble. Now let's think about this for a second. We've got the pieces, the parts, and we got to put them together. Well, let's forget about drawing for a second and let's go to music. In music, the parts would be called the notes. The notes. Now, hitting a note on a piano is not particularly difficult. In fact, even hitting the chords where you have to hit 3 notes together to make one sound, or 4 notes or whatever it is. I don't play the piano, so I couldn't tell you. But hitting those notes comes fairly easily, fairly simply. With a little bit of practice, you can hit them pretty well perfect every single time. It doesn't take long. It takes a week or two, a semester or two, a year or two, and we can get control of those basic notes and those basic chords. And that's true in structure too. If we think of the structures as the old standbys, the balls, the boxes, and the tubes, that's not a real difficult concept. We can even get children to draw those simple shapes fairly successfully, fairly soon. However, to make the music, it's not about the notes, but it's hitting the notes, finding the notes in just the right time. And that is what creates the song. The song or the melody is how those notes go together. Notice that getting the parts of the music is not so difficult. It comes fairly easily for us, and we can get better and better and refine it through our career and all that good stuff. But still, the basic idea and the basic skill set comes fairly easily. It's getting them to relate together. I can hit every note on the piano. I'm a lousy piano player because I can't get those notes to relate, to connect well. If we were dancing, the steps can come fairly quickly. If I was a ballet dancer, which I'm not, I might have to stretch a little bit. It might take me a few weeks, a few months, probably a few years to get all those dance moves. But most of the dance moves would come fairly simply. But I'm a lousy dancer because I can't get those steps to fit beautifully. I can't flow from one position to the other. I can't connect them in a beautiful, truthful way, and so I'm not such a good dancer either. And we can go through every art form with that same binary system. The story writing is about the character going through a character arc, going through the scenes in the story, coming up with a character, a hero, a villain, a conflicted individual, not so difficult, but getting them to move through a believable powerful story is extremely difficult. And so what we find is in every single art form, we have the same binary system and we have the same difficult problem. It's not so hard getting the parts, the pieces to work together. We can get some basic control fairly soon and do fairly well with it. But getting those pieces to work well together within the parameters of the art form, the logic of the art form, is horribly difficult. And that's where we struggle, and that's where we spend our whole career trying to get control of that information. That is what we call gesture in drawing, but we call it color harmony when we're dealing with color. We call it melody when we're dealing with music. We call it character arc when we're dealing with writing, and we call it the dance when we're dealing with dance steps. So that's our problem. So now let's define this a little bit more specifically, because connection is an interesting idea. It's not a particularly useful idea. So we got to figure out what that means. So what we're really after, though, we know, is that gesture then is the connection between the parts, how they fit, how they relate together, the relationship between the parts. So now we know our problem. We've got to get control of the parts, and then we have to understand the relationship. We have to fit those parts together. How do we get this piece to fit with this piece beautifully and believably? How do we get several pieces to flow or bind or bump or fit together? Well, let's define this a little more functionally then. Gesture then is the connection between the parts, the relationship between the parts, how those parts fit. Let's call gesture the long axis. Gesture is going to be defined as a long axis. Why? Because we're going to find it's very useful, very helpful for us. Gesture will be the long axis of any form we choose. And this is why we're doing the long axis. When we look at the human body, more or less everything in the human body from head to toe is long in length and thin across. Long and thin, long and thin, long and thin. And notice also, so when we deal with the length, we're dealing with the major axis of any particular form we're drawing. You can argue on the hips that that's not true, but it's close enough for us. But everything else, certainly, neck and torso and legs and all the limbs, of course, they're all long axis. The nose, the fingers, all long and narrow. The other thing we notice is when we start going from one part to the next, or from one part to the next, the pieces all fit from end to end to end. And so if we draw the length, the long axis of that part in question, we're going to be also implying how that part fits at the form above it, if there is a form above it, and the form below it. How are we going to draw that hand into that wrist and that hand into the fingers? When we deal with a long axis, we'll start to see that connection. So let me move over here a little bit more. You won't see much of me, but that's okay. You'll see more of the drawing pad. And let's look at this. If I draw the forearm as a long axis, and when I draw anything, I'm going to draw with light lines, and I'm going to draw them darker so you can see them well on camera, but light lines that I can erase or correct or render over. I'm going to try and get a process that I can build on top of and not have a dead end, but something that can flow into a beautiful finished drawing or painting. And how I'm going to draw this form is exactly how I would draw it on the canvas before I painted it. It's going to be the same process. I just do it with a brush rather than a Sharpie, and I do it with thinned out paint rather than the ink in here. Now, if I draw the long axis, this is what it gives me. I've got a nice long line. That line to that part, in this case it's going to be the forearm part, is going to eventually move off into the hand and move on down into the upper arm. When I add the part then, I'm going to draw just a simple shape. I'm going to draw a simple shape, and I'll draw several lines when I do it. The reason I'm drawing several lines is I want to make sure I get it just right, or as close to right as I conceive of at this point. And so if I draw a line that's not so good, I'll keep going until I find the one line I need, and then eventually I'll draw it darker. I'll render on top of that one line, and that'll give me move me towards the finish that I'm after. But more importantly, as I'm conceiving of this form, of this part, I want to be able to draw this side in relationship to this side. Remember, the difficult thing about art is the relationship. And it's really all the relationships. In a painting, it's all the colors, not just two of the colors working. In a figure, it's all of the forms and all of the gestures, all of the structures, all the connections, foreground and background. Everything has to work together. And so it's a juggling act trying to get all these things to work. So I want a process that leads me towards that sense of holding everything together in relationship, everything in my mind, suspending everything and working it and developing it together and not in isolation. So if I draw several lines here, not only does it give me a chance to get the one line that's the most accurate, at least as far as I can tell at this point, I can always change my mind, but also as I draw this several times, I start to get in a groove. And there's a muscle memory that kicks in. And as I'm drawing this, now I can glance over at this. And now I can start comparing and seeing how those lines relate together, how they relate together. So we're drawing the connection between the parts, relationship, the gesture. We're defining that as a long axis. I drew the length of that forearm. I haven't told you how I chose that length or how I drew the character to the line. We'll get into that in a little bit. But I made my mark, so let's just stick with that.